In the winter of 1880, Nebraska lay frozen beneath a sky as pale as bone. The prairie winds howled like mourning mothers, rattling the wooden boards of farmhouses already brittle with hunger and despair. It was the kind of cold that silenced animals, that pressed itself against your lungs until every breath felt stolen. And in one such house, distant from the nearest village, a family sat at the table, bowls before them, steam rising faintly from a meal that should have brought comfort. But comfort was absent. Instead, the taste carried something unspeakable, something that clawed at the mind of every soul who dared to swallow. The farmer's wife, her face half hidden in the gloom of the oil lamp, watched each mouthful with a calmness that felt unnatural, as if she knew what they did not. You see, history often buries its most grotesque truths beneath shallow graves of euphemism. They call it hardship, they call it survival. But those words are designed to pacify you, to shield you from the horror of what people truly did when pushed to the edge. And in Nebraska in that bitter year, one woman crossed a threshold that no return could undo. The story whispered through county lines, carried in shivering tones across church pews, and eventually dismissed as madness. But it was not madness. It was hunger, weaponized, ritualized, and masked beneath the duties of a wife. Imagine it now, the sound of spoons against tin bowls, the scent that was familiar yet wrong, the unease that tightened in the chest but could not be spoken aloud. Her children, too young to recognize the truth, ate without protest. Her husband, weathered and broken by failed harvests, consumed the flesh without realizing it was his own bloodline he devoured. And she, the orchestrator, the silent priestess of this forbidden feast, sat in the shadows with eyes that reflected not shame but something else. Power. For in feeding them their own, she was not merely sustaining life, she was binding them to her will in a way no man of faith, no law of court, no decree of government could ever replicate. And here, at the threshold of this descent, I ask you to do something dangerous. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The Nebraska of 1880 was not the land of prosperity you imagine when you hear the word frontier. It was a place where dreams froze in the soil before they ever had the chance to bloom. Families carved homesteads out of endless plains, battling storms of dust in summer and ice in winter. The newspapers promised opportunity, land for the taking, wealth for the hardworking. But those promises rotted quickly beneath the reality of failed crops, dying livestock, and children coughing in beds lined with straw. Hunger was not occasional here. It was a permanent guest, seated at every table, speaking louder than prayer. The farmer's family was no different. Their house, a modest timber frame, stood crooked against the wind. Each creak of its boards at night carried dread, as though the structure itself resented sheltering the broken. By day, the fields offered nothing but frost-bitten stalks, brittle reminders of labor that had yielded no reward. The father, once proud, had become gaunt and hollow-eyed, his spirit eroded by debts and disappointments. The children, thin as kindling, shuffled barefoot across dirt floors, their laughter silenced long ago. But it was the wife, pale and quiet, who lingered most strangely. Neighbors recalled her as a woman who spoke little and stared often, her gaze fixed not on the horizon, but downward, as if she could see something beneath the earth that no one else dared look upon. In church, she whispered not hymns, but private words under her breath. Some claimed she was praying to saints older than Scripture. Others said she was counting, always counting, as though measuring the days until some unspeakable act. They noticed, too, how she lingered near the well at dusk, her figure dark against the dimming sky, lips moving, though no sound escaped. Ordinary life in Nebraska was already eerie, but around this family, the unease seemed amplified, concentrated, like a sickness in the air. You could sense it in the way neighbors avoided their path, in the way dogs growled when she approached, in the way no one ever saw smoke from their chimney, though the cold was brutal. Something was wrong in that house, and when something is wrong long enough, it stops being chance. it becomes design. Now, you have heard the first whispers of the setting, the soil, the hunger, the silence before the storm. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The farmer's wife, whose name has been whispered and erased from the records, was not always the shadow she had become. In her youth, she had been considered gentle, dutiful, a woman shaped by hardship, but not yet hardened by it. She married young, as most did in Nebraska, pledging herself to a man who promised safety, stability, and the chance at a family. And for a time they were ordinary. Their laughter echoed faintly across the frozen plains, and the children, though fragile from constant hunger, clung to her skirts as though the world had yet to betray them. But there was always a shadow behind her eyes, a weight she carried silently, unseen by her husband, and unnoticed by the neighbors who only glimpsed the surface. The darkness began quietly, imperceptibly. She watched the way men fell ill in the community, how the sickly groans of the starving echoed through the barns at night. She noted the decay of flesh, the inevitability of death, and something within her mind began to twist. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was logic, perhaps it was something old, something primal that recognized the power contained in life itself and in its inevitable surrender. She began experimenting in small, secret ways, testing her control over the boundaries of survival. A child left too long without bread, a family dog missing in the night. Each act, unnoticed, refined her understanding. By the time winter's frost had set in fully, she had evolved into something neither entirely human nor entirely moral. The home that once nurtured life became a laboratory, and the family itself became her subjects. She observed their weakness, their trust, their unspoken dependence upon her hands to bring sustenance. And then, in the coldest of moments, she realized that survival could be manipulated, transformed into obedience, submission, and an unbreakable chain of psychological control. She learned that to dominate the essence of life, to bend it, one did not need weapons or fire. One needed knowledge of fear, ritual, and the fragile human mind. Even now, the children's laughter had vanished entirely, replaced with quiet compliance. Their father, once proud and strong, moved like a man shadowed by his own dependence, unaware that the sustenance he received was itself a cruel lie. He trusted her, as all men trust the hands that feed them. And in that trust, she found her power. She had learned the most ancient and forbidden truth. Life, when given and withdrawn with precision, is the most absolute form of control. Notice this, and understand it fully, for it is the key that opens the door to what comes next. The line between caretaker and predator is thinner than you think, and once crossed, the consequences extend beyond a single household into the very fabric of society. The unease began in whispers. Neighbors noticed that meals were never left over, that the family's larder seemed to replenish itself unnaturally fast, despite poor harvests. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence or luck, but then small disappearances punctuated the landscape. The neighbor's cat vanished. Farmhand failed to return from the frozen fields. A crate of preserved meat seemed to disappear overnight. No one saw her leave the house late at night, but the shadows moving behind her curtains suggested more than sleep or domestic routine. The air around the farmhouse carried a strange scent, metallic and warm, that clung to the noses of anyone who passed too close. Reports began trickling into town. One widow claimed her husband had been offered food by the farmer's wife when he collapsed from exhaustion, only to return home hours later with a pallor that made his family recoil. Another farmer swore he saw the wife dragging a heavy bundle across the frozen yard, her steps measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial. And yet, no authority intervened. The sheriff, a man who had seen every crime from theft to murder in the county, approached the house only to turn back, uneasy. He could not explain why, but his instincts screamed that stepping inside would violate something older than the law. Inside, the family's routine grew stranger. The children ate with obedience that bordered on trance. The father, once questioning, now nodded silently at every instruction. Too thin, too tired, too reliant to resist. And the wife? She watched, she measured, she recorded. Every sigh, every glance, every flicker of hesitation became data in her mind. A map of control. The line between nourishment and manipulation blurred. Was she feeding them to keep them alive? Or was she feeding them to test the extent of her influence over life itself? Strangers began whispering rumors along the county roads. She serves them in a way they cannot see, one man said, voice low. It's what they eat. That's what scares me. Another added, by the time they realize it's too late, they will eat without choice, and the hunger will never end. Fear spread, but fear in the rural communities of Nebraska was often dismissed as imagination. People said it was cold or hunger talking, but the truth is harsher. Sometimes imagination is only perception catching up to reality. And here, as the tension coils around the house like a winter storm, understand this. The unfolding mystery is not simply about disappearance or consumption. It is about power, hidden knowledge, and the deliberate corruption of trust within the most sacred circle, the family. It was on a night when the wind tore across the plains like knives that the horrifying truth revealed itself. The neighbors had long suspected something, but what they discovered surpassed every nightmare their minds could construct. The sheriff, finally summoned by a frantic call from a distant relative, entered the farmhouse with a lantern that barely pierced the thick shadows. The air inside was heavy, warm, almost cloying, carrying a scent both familiar and grotesque. It was then that he noticed the table, cleared of any ordinary food, and the pot of stew simmering quietly over the hearth. It looked at first harmless, a woman's meal prepared for her family. But the way it shimmered, the texture that refused to settle, betrayed a truth too monstrous to confront at first glance. The first child, pale and hollow-eyed, stepped forward to serve the bowls. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. The tremor was ritual, conditioning, a lesson drilled into obedience over months of subtle preparation. And then the sheriff saw it. The meat, thick and glistening, carried the unmistakable human pattern of sinew and tissue. The realization struck like lightning. What they had been eating, what they had been unknowingly consuming for weeks, was their own kin. The mother, serene and composed, moved among them with a calm precision that made her resemble a priest conducting a sacred rite, not a murderer in the shadows. The sheriff staggered back, Kay gagging against the smell and the enormity of comprehension. He tried to alert the father, but the man's eyes were dull, empty of resistance, already conditioned to compliance. The children lifted their spoons mechanically, eyes lowered, lips moving with the rhythm of someone reciting prayers they could not fully understand. And through it all, the wife remained the orchestrator of this living nightmare, feeding, observing, measuring the limits of obedience and terror. Outside, whispers carried across the frozen fields. Some townsfolk claimed they heard the family's laughter, soft and brittle, echoing through the night, a laughter devoid of joy, a sound that betrayed an unnatural equilibrium. They called for intervention, but the institutions of law and church were distant, constrained by procedural lethargy, unable to react to horrors that defied conventional definitions. And that was precisely her power, to operate in the space where law, morality, and fear intersected, to manipulate life itself without immediate consequence. And here, understand the magnitude of what unfolded. It was not merely murder. It was a lesson in control, in subverting trust, in weaponizing the most intimate human acts, eating, breathing, obeying. In the quiet of that farmhouse, a woman had discovered a power older than courts, older than clergy, older than law. The aftermath of that night rippled across the county with a force that no one could contain. The sheriff, pale and trembling, returned to town with fragments of the truth, but the full horror could not be spoken aloud. The newspapers printed sanitized versions, tales of poor families starving, of a woman driven mad by winter, of tragedies too ghastly to detail. They omitted the flesh, the ritual, the obedience, and the psychological terror that had been meticulously cultivated within that home. The story was buried in euphemisms, a protective veil designed to shield society from knowledge it could not safely confront. But rumors spread faster than print, carried by traders, PRO, eachers, and wandering farmhands. Whispers told of bowls served with deliberate care, of family members consuming what should have nourished them, and of the eerie composure of the woman who orchestrated it all. The local authorities convened a trial, though its proceedings were more ceremonial than judicial. The father, hollowed by both guilt and conditioning, testified only in fragments. The children, now distant and mechanical, repeated phrases without understanding their meaning. The mother, the architect of the atrocity, displayed a calmness that unnerved every observer. Experts called in from distant counties could find no precedent. Physicians, psychologists, and clergy alike were confounded. Some claimed it was hysteria, some demonic influence, others a calculated form of psychological mastery. Yet every conclusion fell short, for the truth existed outside the bounds of ordinary comprehension. Even after arrests were made, the institutional response was cautious. Courts hesitated to detail the case fully, fearing moral panic and contagion of knowledge. Clergy declared the woman a cautionary tale, but refrained from revealing the precise mechanics of her acts. Neighbors were silenced by both fear and social pressure. The house itself became a symbol of unspoken terror, boarded and abandoned, yet its shadow lingered over the land. The community adapted. Children spoke in coded warnings, adults avoided mention of the family, and law enforcement limited access, as if proximity alone could awaken what had been contained. This was not mere suppression. It was the deliberate shaping of history, the conscious control of memory to protect society from truths deemed too dangerous to bear. But here lies the deeper lesson. Whenever an atrocity is sanitized, when its details are hidden under polite euphemism, power is reinforced. Those who know the secret, who understand the precise mechanisms of obedience, fear, and control, inherit knowledge far beyond the law. And those who obey the sanitized narrative become complicit in their own manipulation, unwitting cogs in a system designed to obscure the most dangerous truths. Now, as you listen, reflect. The horror was not only in what was done, it was in what was allowed to persist, in the control wielded through secrecy, in the subtle corruption of trust and perception. And the most terrifying realization is this: once you know, you can never unknow. Even months after the arrests, the farmhouse on the Nebraska plains exhaled a silence that was louder than any scream. Travelers who passed by swore the walls whispered, carrying fragments of memory that had soaked into the timber. No one dared enter, yet the curiosity of the human mind is relentless. Children in neighboring homesteads reported shadowed figures at dusk, movements too fluid and deliberate to be mere tricks of the wind. Farmers would swear they smelled that metallic tang, the scent of iron and ritual, drifting across the frostbitten fields. The widow's presence, though absent in body, had rooted itself in the psyche of every living being who had come into contact with her influence. Even the father, once a figure of authority and resilience, had become a husk. His will was eroded, his thoughts obedient to patterns implanted by months of careful conditioning. He could barely recognize the enormity of the acts committed within his own household. And the children, now growing in the aftermath, carried a haunting duality. Survivors, yet imprinted with behaviors and habits that reflected their mother's mastery over their earliest understanding of life and trust. They were vessels of her power, and even distance could not sever the control she had cultivated with precision. The town itself began to fracture psychologically. Neighbors avoided gatherings, church attendance waned, and casual conversation was replaced by glances and coded language. Even the priacs, Hers, who had once denounced the woman publicly, confessed in private that the fear she inspired was more potent than their sermons, more immediate than law or scripture. Her acts had revealed a terrifying truth. Power does not lie in visible force alone. Real domination is subtle. It is the manipulation of trust, the shaping of perception, the careful orchestration of obedience without resistance. And here, let us step closer to the forbidden knowledge that most dare not examine. The widow's crime was both horrific and instructive. By turning the most intimate acts of life, feeding, eating, breathing, into instruments of control, she transcended mere morality. She stepped into a plane where human institutions, no matter how powerful, could not reach. Law was impotent, religion was constrained, social norms, though rigid, were rendered meaningless. In her hands, obedience became an art, fear a sculptor, and the family itself a canvas upon which she painted a doctrine older than history. This is why history buried her story, why newspapers erased the specifics, and why most accounts speak only of hunger and madness. It was not the horror of her actions alone they feared. It was the lesson she offered. That control over life and perception, subtle and unseen, can exceed the reach of kings, courts, and preachers alike. And now, as you absorb these truths, recognize the weight. The descent has begun, and once you understand the mechanics of her dominion, you cannot return to innocence. By the spring thaw of 1881, the psychological shadow of the farmer's wife had spread beyond the farmhouse, creeping into the collective consciousness of the county. People walked with suspicion, their eyes darting toward any unfamiliar figure or movement, their conversations punctuated by silences heavier than the snow that had just melted. The horror was no longer confined to a single home. It had infiltrated the very perception of reality. Neighbors began to second-guess every interaction, every gift, every gesture of kindness. A loaf of bread offered in passing could now carry the weight of suspicion, and a warm meal became a potential weapon. Fear, they realized too late, had become contagious. The family, now fragmented by trauma and obedience, moved through their days with meticulous routine. The children, trained to comply with every subtle cue, became living extensions of their mother's will, her lessons in dominance and trust encoded in every glance and movement. They did not simply act out of fear, they had internalized it. Their compliance was the product of months, maybe years, of precise psychological manipulation. The father, once the head of the household, now operated mechanically, a marionette whose strings had been invisibly tugged. And yet, through all this, the mother remained unseen in her true capacity, the architect of a system far more complex and enduring than any brute act of violence. Beyond the family, rumors had taken on a life of their own. Traders traveling the plains spoke in hushed tones of a woman who could bend life to her will, who transformed sustenance into obedience, and whose methods surpassed the comprehension of the strongest men. Priests, compelled to maintain moral order, whispered warnings from pulpits, but avoided specifics. Courts reviewed reports, but dismissed them as exaggerations of rural superstition. And therein lies the lesson. The most dangerous power is not visible. It is subtle, psychological, and capable of shaping obedience without leaving a mark that can be prosecuted. Even in the distant towns where the story had begun to morph into legend, the widow's influence persisted. People reported strange patterns in their dreams, sensations of being watched, and the irresistible pull to question authority and family in ways they had not before. Her acts, though localized, had rippled through consciousness itself, planting seeds of fear, control, and curiosity. Those seeds were the true inheritance, knowledge too potent, too dangerous to reveal openly, yet impossible to erase. And here, my student, is the moment you must acknowledge. Fear can be cultivated like a crop. Obedience can be nurtured with patience. And once the mind is molded in secrecy, its power can reach beyond law, beyond church, beyond any institution claiming dominion. This is why the widow's story was buried, sanitized, and misrepresented. She did not simply kill, she demonstrated a principle older than nations, older than kings. By the heat of summer in 1881, what the farmer's wife had created within her home had transformed into a system of ritual and methodical control that defied comprehension. Each day followed a sequence so precise it could have been written into law. The children awakened to exact instructions, their movements choreographed to serve both survival and obedience. The father, weakened by hunger and conditioned by fear, executed his role without question, unable to perceive the invisible patterns binding him. And through it all she observed, measured, and adjusted, a master of timing, perception, and human weakness. Her methods were not haphazard. She understood the fundamental dynamics of dependence. She provided sustenance and withdrawal in perfect alternation, crafting both trust and dread simultaneously. Meals were never predictable. They arrived when desired, withheld when tested. The taste of the food was designed to be familiar enough to avoid suspicion, yet infused with subtle reminders that nothing in that household belonged to chance. Every glance, every gesture, every moment of attention was a calculated tool to reinforce her dominance. By the time a child's hand reached for the plate, the lesson had been implanted. Life came at her discretion, obedience was mandatory, and questioning her authority was a danger no one could survive. But the true horror lay in her understanding of the most intimate form of power, perception itself. She trained her family to doubt their senses, to question their instincts, to trust her alone as the arbiter of reality. When they hesitated, she manipulated the environment. A door left slightly ajar, a pot of stew placed strategically, the distant clatter of tools, until obedience became instinct. Even fear became a tool she controlled, molding it as carefully as clay. Those who think domination relies on brute force have never witnessed the subtlety of her work. The mind, once properly conditioned, can be bent more efficiently than the strongest chains or walls. And so the house became a theater of control, a laboratory of obedience, a prison invisible to outsiders. The people within were alive, yet in some fundamental way, they had ceased to exist for themselves. Every act of daily life was a lesson, every mouthful consumed an exercise in submission. She had discovered a principle older than tyranny. True mastery over another is not achieved by terror alone, but by shaping the very perception of life, trust, and mortality. Now, as you hear this, remember, the widow's methods were not an anomaly of desperation. They were a deliberate, calculated study in the mechanics of human obedience, refined to near perfection. And those who understand such mechanics, even now, inherit knowledge that most institutions, most societies, deliberately obscure. By late autumn of 1881, the widow's influence had begun to creep beyond the walls of her farmhouse, spilling into the wider Nebraska community in ways both subtle and terrifying. Farmers passing along the frozen plains would notice the odd symmetry of her children's movements when they fetched water or carried firewood. Precise, unhesitant, almost unnatural. Merchants reported trades made with the family were always exact, down to the smallest fraction, and never disputed. The father, once robust and independent, who attended town gatherings with the vacant obedience of a man whose autonomy had been carefully stripped. And while outsiders could not see her directly, her methodology left traces, a pattern, a rhythm, a whisper of control that clung to anyone who interacted with her household. Rumors inevitably began to spread. At first, they were dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. Travelers spoke of meals that seemed too perfect, of behaviors that hinted at something unnatural, of eyes that observed and measured more than they should. Teachers at the local school noticed that her children spoke only when allowed, paused mid-sentence as if receiving an invisible command, and sometimes fell silent without explanation. Even ministers visiting the community sensed the quiet unease, a tension too precise to be coincidental. and in every whisper, in every hesitant glance, the widow's reach became increasingly evident. She had created a network of fear and obedience that extended beyond her own family. Her genius lay in subtlety. She did not overtly threaten. She did not openly punish. Instead, she curated the environment to reinforce her authority. A delayed meal, a careful glance, the mere suggestion of observation, each became a tool to shape perception. The community, unknowing, became participants in her experiment. Fear of the unknown, combined with awe at her meticulousness, amplified her presence. Men and women alike, even those with no direct contact, sensed the gravity of her power, the danger of questioning what they could not fully comprehend. By now, the widow had mastered something far beyond simple domestic manipulation. She had discovered a principle ancient and insidious. Control is most absolute when invisible. When obedience is voluntary, when fear is internalized, when the mind believes it is acting freely, then the chains are strongest. And those who incline unto this mastery, even at a distance, carry its weight, sometimes unknowingly, into the rest of their lives. Understand this, for it is a lesson that history rarely admits. True domination is not loud, not visible, not easily challenged. It is quiet, it is precise, and it is everywhere the mind allows it to be. By the winter of 1881, whispers had solidified into unease that gripped the county like a frost that would not thaw. The widow's household, once merely a point of curiosity, had become a psychological epicenter of fear. Neighbors began noticing subtle irregularities, children vanishing from chores for minutes longer than necessary, livestock behaving erratically when she approached, men and women suddenly questioning the trustworthiness of even their closest kin. The pattern of obedience she had crafted in her family now seemed to extend outward, influencing perception itself. Ordinary people began to doubt what they saw, what they smelled, and even what they felt in their own homes. Rumors grew darker and more specific. One farmer claimed he had glimpsed her moving in the shadows behind the barn, a bundle in her arms that moved with unnatural weight. Another recounted the sound of singing, soft, melodic, yet wrong, drifting across the frozen plains at night. It was as if the very land was being altered, reshaped by her presence, and those who came near felt compelled to comply with the invisible rules she had laid down. Some whispered she could instill obedience simply by looking at you, a silent command carried in the tilt of her head, or the calm steadiness of her gaze. Even law enforcement began to feel the weight of her influence. The sheriff, who had previously skirted involvement due to fear and incredulity, found himself second-guessing every report, questioning the validity of his own senses. Documents filed with the county reflected a growing sense of disbelief, a struggle to categorize events that defied normal explanation. And yet, the widow remained untouchable, invisible in her power. She did not need to strike or punish openly. Her dominance was embedded in the minds of those around her, a quiet terror that could neither be fully articulated nor resisted. Psychologists and clergy, distant observers brought in to advise the town, quickly realized the enormity of what they were facing. They recognized patterns consistent with control far beyond ordinary coercion. Subtle conditioning, reinforced obedience, manipulation of trust, and the use of fear as both motivator and deterrent. And yet, they were powerless to stop her. Conventional methods, law, prayer, social pressure, proved ineffective. The widow had transcended ordinary forms of influence, stepping into a realm of psychological dominion so complete that even trained minds faltered in the attempt to intervene. At this point, the lesson becomes unavoidable. When control operates invisibly, when obedience is internalized rather than enforced, it spreads faster and deeper than any army or court could ever hope to manage. And those who experience it, even peripherally, are forever changed, unable to perceive the boundaries of influence without recalling the invisible chains that once gripped them. Even the most carefully constructed dominion eventually shows fractures, and by early spring of 1882, faint tremors began appearing in the widow's meticulously controlled world. The children, trained for obedience since infancy, started exhibiting small signs of hesitation. A pause before taking a bite, a flicker of doubt when following her gaze, subtle shifts in posture, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but glaring to her. She noticed these deviations immediately, her eyes narrowing with the precision of a predator who senses a misstep. The cracks were minor, but they were dangerous. Obedience, once cracked, could spread like frost under a door, and even the smallest rebellion held the power to destabilize her system. The father, weakened but not entirely erased, began murmuring questions under his breath, tiny, almost silent probes that tested the boundaries of her authority. They were fragments of doubt, fleeting and cautious, but they introduced a tension that had been absent for months. For the first time, her control required active reinforcement, subtle recalibration. Each hesitation, each question, became a lesson in vigilance, a reminder that power is never absolute, only maintained through constant observation, adaptation, and psychological reinforcement. Outside the household, the community sensed shifts as well. Rumors that had once been quiet whispers became conversations laden with suspicion. Neighbors shared glances of uncertainty, noting the odd behaviors of the family, the strange rhythms in their daily routines, the almost hypnotic obedience that had, until now, seemed absolute. Some townsfolk attempted intervention in small ways, a stray gesture of kindness to the children, subtle guidance to the father, even a whispered warning. Each act of resistance, however minor, generated ripples through the widow's invisible empire, revealing that while mastery can be formidable, it is not infallible. Even the environment seemed to respond. Animals, long accustomed to the household's rhythm, began acting erratically. Dogs refusing to obey, horses balking at familiar paths, birds avoiding the property entirely. The widow, ever perceptive, interpreted these signs with cold precision, understanding that her control extended beyond human subjects and into every element that touched her domain. Nature itself, she realized, could mirror the cracks in her psychological system. And so the lesson emerges. Dominance is not permanent, obedience is not guaranteed, and the moment the mind begins to question, even subtly, the delicate structure of control begins to erode. True power, she knew, demanded constant attention, ruthless calculation, and the unrelenting elimination of uncertainty. For in the Essene, shadows of doubt lies the seed of liberation, and the potential unraveling of even the most absolute dominion. The widow's awareness of the cracks in her control did not bring panic. It brought calculation. She had mastered subtlety, but subtlety alone would not correct emerging disobedience. By late spring of 1882, she escalated her methods, introducing rituals of discipline so precise and psychologically potent that fear and obedience became inseparable. Meals were no longer merely sustenance, they were tests. Every bite was observed, measured, and responded to. Hesitation meant subtle withdrawal, a bowl removed, a glance denied, a whisper of disapproval so faint, yet charged with menace, that the mind internalized it instantly. The children, sensing even these micro-penalties, began recalibrating their compliance almost reflexively. The father, though weakened, experienced a more insidious form of correction. He had become aware of his doubt, his murmured questions and fleeting hesitation. The widow did not confront him directly. She manipulated his perception, an absent glance from a child, the creak of a door, a sound in the empty barn, all orchestrated to reinforce the illusion of omnipresence and omniscience. Each calculated act reminded him that his autonomy was an illusion and that obedience was not negotiated but extracted through a combination of anticipation and fear. In this quiet, relentless way, she rebuilt the walls of control, fortifying them against the small seeds of resistance that had begun to sprout. Her methods were not only psychological, but ritualistic, almost ceremonial. Certain tasks, chopping wood, fetching water, preparing meals, were timed, observed, and corrected with invisible precision. Every act of life within the house became both instruction and reinforcement, each gesture a lesson in her absolute dominion. She taught them that surveying itself was conditional, earned only through perfect compliance, and she proved it. Hunger returned swiftly to those who faltered, subtle yet immediate, conditioning the mind to fear failure as much as death. Beyond the household, the subtle echoes of her reign continued to influence the community. Farmers, merchants, and even clergy began noting the unnatural precision of the family's behavior, the strange cadence of their daily life. Some whispered warnings to one another, yet none dared directly intervene. The widow's invisible empire extended beyond her immediate family, instilling a latent fear in every observer. Even the act of watching, even the act of hearing about her methods, left a psychological mark, a recognition of power that operated without threat, without force, yet with undeniable effect. Here is the lesson, the terrifying principle. Absolute control is not merely physical, it is psychological. It is the orchestration of perception, anticipation, and subtle consequence. And once internalized, obedience becomes instinctive, fear becomes self-directed, and resistance nearly impossible. By midsummer of 1882, the widow's carefully constructed world faced a new threat: scrutiny from beyond the county. Reports of her household's unnatural precision, the family's eerie obedience, and the strange behavior of the children reached the ears of distant lawmen and curious journalists. Letters were sent, inquiries made, but few dared approach. The widow had anticipated such intrusion. Her reputation alone acted as a psychological barrier. Travelers who came too close reported feeling watched, measured, as though the very air around the farmhouse carried invisible tendrils of command, and in the hearts of those who knew the rumors, fear amplified perception. The sheriff, long a reluctant observer, now faced pressure to act. Investigators, both official and unofficial, began approaching the property with caution. Some turned back at the gate, unsettled by the unnatural quiet that lay like a weight over the homestead. Others pressed forward, only to find themselves second-guessing everything they saw. Children behaving mechanically, the father's vacant compliance, the widow's serene control. Their reports became contradictory, fragmented, filled with uncertainty. What could be proven? What could be described? What was real versus imagined? And therein lay her power. She had created an environment where perception itself was weaponized, where the mind doubted its own senses before the law could intervene. Inside the house, the widow sensed the growing encroachment. She increased her psychological reinforcement. Tasks were executed with exacting precision, deviations punished with subtle yet terrifying immediacy. The children, conditioned to anticipate consequences, responded with near instantaneous compliance. The father, aware yet powerless, became both observer and participant, a silent witness to the reassertion of absolute authority. And all the while the widow orchestrated the household as if it were a stage, every gesture, every glance, every footstep choreographed to instill fear, respect, and obedience simultaneously. Even the local community, which had long been silent or compliant out of fear, sensed the growing tension. Whispers spread faster than ever, tales of meals served with strange ritual precision, of children who spoke only when permitted, of a mother whose presence alone commanded reality. Curiosity and dread mingled, and the invisible chains of her dominion reached farther than she could walk, influencing thought, perception, and behavior across the county. And here lies the chilling principle: when mastery extends beyond the immediate environment, when fear and obedience infiltrate minds at a distance, conventional force cannot compete. Power becomes self-sustaining, reinforced by belief and antics, passion, and those who attempt to intervene are often too late, trapped by their own perceptions, before they can act. The confrontation came quietly, deceptively, like the slow approach of a storm across the plains. Investigators, emboldened by reports and persistent rumors, approached the farmhouse with a combination of curiosity and dread. They arrived in the late afternoon, when the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted land. At first, the house appeared as any other. Weathered wood, smoke curling from the chimney, a soft hum of domestic life. But the air was thick, almost viscous, carrying the faint metallic tang that had marked the widow's dominion. Every step closer to the front door brought a tightening in the chest, a subtle unease that gnawed at certainty. The children, anticipating the arrival, moved silently through the house, executing their roles with near-perfect precision. The father met the visitors with vacant eyes, nodding but saying nothing. And then, the widow appeared, calm, composed, her presence radiating a force invisible yet undeniable. She did not raise her voice, did not gesticulate. Her power operated through subtleties, the tilt of her head, the piercing gaze, the near imperceptible tightening of her posture. Within moments, the investigators began questioning their own perceptions, noting minor anomalies and dismissing them as coincidence. They had expected a chaotic scene, a desperate woman, but what confronted them was precision, control, and the quiet orchestration of fear. One investigator, braver than the rest, attempted to question the children directly. They responded mechanically, almost rehearsed, eyes lowered, words clipped and correct. Any hesitation triggered a shift in the widow's attention, a subtle cue that sent immediate signals through the family. A look, a slight motion, a silent command, reminding them who controlled not just action, but perception itself. The observer felt an instinctive tightening in the mind, a sudden irrational doubt about the reality before him. Was the family truly obedient, or was his own mind bending under unseen pressure? The confrontation did not escalate into violence. It could not. Her power was psychological, not brute, and its reach extended beyond the visible. Every question, every move by the investigators was met with invisible resistance, subtle manipulation, and unwavering composure. By the time they left, shaken and uncertain, the widow had reaffirmed her dominion without striking a blow. She had demonstrated a principle older than any law. Mastery of mind and perception is absolute when fear is internalized and obedience is voluntary. And here is the lesson that must be absorbed. Confrontation alone cannot dismantle a system built on psychological dominion. The strongest chains are invisible, operating within thought, perception, and trust. Those who encounter it, even as outsiders, are never the same again. The aftermath of the confrontation lingered like a shadow that refused to dissipate. The investigators returned to their offices and homes, but the experience haunted them. Each detail, the children's mechanical obedience, the father's vacant compliance, the widow's calm omnipresence, replayed relentlessly in their minds. Dreams were invaded by fleeting images of the house, the sound of distant footsteps, and the subtle, omniscient gaze of a woman who had never raised her voice, yet commanded complete control. Rational explanations failed. Reports filed with local authorities were riddled with hesitation, contradictions, and uncertainty. No one could articulate the truth fully because the truth itself had already altered perception. Even the local community felt the tremors of her influence. Farmers who had been cautious now walked with heightened vigilance, whispering warnings and exchanging furtive glances. Merchants hesitated to transact with the family, not out of moral outrage, but because the precision and fear embedded in every interaction left a lingering unease. The widow's methods had created a contagion of psychological tension, an invisible chain linking observers to her household. People who had never stepped foot inside felt the weight of her mastery, experiencing the subtle coercion of mind, the anticipation of punishment, and the deep-rooted influence of obedience transmitted through rumor, fear, and anticipation. Within the family, the subtle cracks remained. Though the confrontation had reinforced compliance, it had also highlighted the fragility of absolute control. The children, still conditioned, sensed a tension that was new, a faint opening where instinct could assert itself. The father's murmured questions, though stifled, were no longer entirely invisible. And the widow, ever vigilant, understood that true mastery required continuous observation, recalibration, and reinforcement. Control, she knew, was not static. It was living, breathing, and adaptive, a force that could falter if neglected even for a moment. The lesson here is as chilling as it is instructive. Power that operates through the mind cannot be quantified, contained, or challenged easily. External pressure, however subtle, can expose fissures even in systems designed to be absolute. And those who witness mastery, even from the outside, carry its imprint indefinitely. Memory itself becomes a vector of influence, a vessel of fear, and a reminder that psychological domination is more enduring than any law, weapon, or visible chain. As you listen now, recognize the gravity. The widow's influence was not merely local, it spread into the minds of anyone who observed, any thought that processed her methods, and any memory that replayed her precision. Knowledge of such power is dangerous, intoxicating, and irreversible. By the autumn of 1882, the cracks within the widow's carefully constructed empire became impossible to ignore. The children, trained to absolute precision, began exhibiting small but undeniable acts of defiance. A delayed response here, a hesitant movement there, minute, almost imperceptible, but sufficient to ignite a ripple of tension that the widow immediately sensed. She observed these deviations with the meticulous patience of a predator studying prey, knowing that even the smallest flicker of doubt could cascade into rebellion if left unchecked. Obedience, she understood, was never guaranteed. It was maintained through relentless psychological pressure, constant reinforcement, and the careful orchestration of fear. The father, too, became more than a passive participant. While outwardly compliant, his internal dialogue sharpened, questioning the morality and necessity of what had been done. He murmured words under his breath, fragments of doubt that slipped past the widow's immediate perception but planted seeds for future resistance. Even the children, though conditioned, were beginning to notice subtle inconsistencies in her behavior, a slight hesitation before issuing a command, a repeated pattern that revealed predictability in her omnipotence. The household, once a perfect machine of obedience, now carried within it the first whispers of rebellion, fragile and tentative, but undeniably alive. This internal tension began to manifest in subtle ways. Meals were eaten more slowly, chores performed with minute errors that tested the widow's tolerance. The rhythm of the household, once flawless, now carried the cadence of resistance. And yet, the widow's response was precise, calculated, and terrifying. She did not lash out in anger. She corrected with subtle manipulations, withholding trust, adjusting glances, and deploying micro-penalties that reinforced her dominance without breaking the fragile morale of her subjects. The children learned quickly that defiance carried invisible consequences, and the father felt the invisible pressure of authority pressing down even as he tested the limits of his compliance. Outside observers, unaware of these internal dynamics, remained convinced of her omnipotence. Traders, neighbors, and visiting clergy continued to report mechanical obedience and unnerving precision, never realizing that the first fractures had already begun. This discrepancy between perception and reality illustrates the widow's true mastery. Control is as much about shaping what others see as it is about manipulating what they feel. Here lies a critical lesson. Even the most absolute systems of psychological domination carry vulnerabilities. Small acts of hesitation, internalized doubt, and quiet observation can plant the seeds of liberation. And once those seeds exist, even invisibly, the architecture of power begins to weaken from within. The widow, ever vigilant, immediately recognized the subtle cracks emerging within her domain. By winter of 1882, her methods intensified, becoming more precise, more ritualized, and more psychologically devastating. The children's hesitations, though slight, were met with carefully calculated reinforcement. A glance withheld, a touch delayed, or a meal served cold became instruments of silent punishment. Each act was designed not merely to correct behavior, but to embed fear deep into the subconscious. Obedience, she knew, must be internalized, and the mind reshaped so thoroughly that resistance would feel unnatural, even impossible. The father, already fractured by months of conditioning, now faced psychological pressures that left him questioning his own perceptions. The widow did not confront him openly. She used suggestion, spatial cues, and the rhythmic predictability of daily life to manipulate him. A chair placed too far, a door slightly ajar, or the distant clink of tools in the barn, all became invisible signals reinforcing the hierarchy she had imposed. He moved through his tasks with mechanical precision, yet each action carried the silent weight of surveillance, a reminder that his thoughts and instincts were no longer his own. Within the household, the children's routines became instruments of control themselves. Chores, meals, and even play were conducted according to strict, unspoken rules. Any deviation triggered a subtle response, invisible to the casual observer, but potent in shaping behavior. They learned that even hesitation could invite consequences. Hunger, isolation, and the piercing gaze of their mother that seemed to see through to the core of their intent. Fear was not applied externally. It was internalized, self-directed, and absolute. Outside, the community remained unaware of these escalating methods. Traders and neighbors observed perfect obedience, never realizing that beneath the surface, a battle of wills was being waged in silence. Even investigators who had previously approached the house with trepidation reported only precision and calm, unaware that the true struggle was psychological, invisible, and ongoing. The widow had transformed her family into a microcosm of control, a laboratory in which obedience was perfected, doubt punished, and fear cultivated with surgical precision. This is the critical insight. True power is not exhibited in overt violence. It is expressed through the manipulation of perception, anticipation, and the internalization of fear. Those who experience it, even indirectly, are forever changed. The widow's methods were not mere cruelty. They were a demonstration of mastery over human will itself. By the early months of 1883, the widow's dominion faced a new and persistent threat: the encroaching scrutiny of outsiders. Rumors, once scattered whispers along the frozen Nebraska plains, had coalesced into reports that could not be ignored. Travelers spoke of a family whose obedience seemed unnatural, whose home radiated an invisible force of control. Merchants and clergy exchanged stories of uncanny precision, of children who acted as extensions of an unseen will. The county's authorities, pressured by increasing accounts, dispatched investigators determined to penetrate the veil of the widow's influence. The widow, however, anticipated every move. Her methods of control had evolved to anticipate intrusion. She had built contingencies for perception itself. When investigators approached, the household responded like a living mechanism. Children executed tasks with flawless timing. The father moved with the precision of one who had relinquished independent thought, and the widow herself remained calm, her presence radiating quiet omnipotence. Observers noted the discipline and synchronicity, unaware that every gesture, every pause, every glance had been orchestrated to manipulate not just action, but perception. Outside the home, the tension among the community intensified. Farmers and neighbors, once fearful of gossip, now became reluctant informants. They spoke cautiously, careful to preserve their own safety while documenting the anomalies. Yet the widow's influence reached even them. Subtle cues, the timing of her walks, the way the children moved in fields, the careful positioning of the father, created doubt in anyone who observed. People questioned not only what they saw, but what they thought they knew. Fear, internalized and invisible, had spread far beyond the walls of the farmhouse. Within the household, the widow escalated her psychological reinforcement. The first signs of hesitation among the children and father were met with precise, calculated corrections. Withholding meals, altering routines, and employing the slightest shift in attention reinforced obedience with terrifying efficiency. These were not punishments as outsiders would recognize them. They were invisible, intimate lessons in control that conditioned the mind more effectively than any lash or lock. The lesson here is stark. Absolute dominion is not destroyed by observation alone. Fear, carefully internalized, can extend beyond the immediate sphere of influence, and those who encounter it, whether directly or peripherally, are marked, their perception subtly altered, their instinct for autonomy tempered by the recognition of power operating unseen. By mid-1883, subtle but undeniable fractures began to appear in the widow's empire. The household, once a near-perfect machine of obedience, now exhibited hesitations that could no longer be entirely masked. A child lingered too long over a chore, the father paused mid-task to murmur a question under his breath, and even the smallest misalignment in her rituals caught the widow's attention immediately. These were not chaotic deviations. They were careful, almost imperceptible acts of resistance, tiny sparks threatening to ignite a larger unraveling. And she sensed them all. The widow responded with precision. Her psychological reinforcement intensified, escalating to a level that left no room for error. Meals were withheld longer, glances became sharper, and the slightest delay in obedience triggered micro-penalties that communicated consequences without overt confrontation. Every gesture was deliberate, every silence loaded with unspoken authority. Yet even with this meticulous recalibration, the cracks were real, and she could feel the tension pulsing through the household. The machine of control was strained, its gears grinding against the first signs of internal rebellion. The children, conditioned for years, began to test boundaries subtly. One would slightly misalign a task, another would speak a word too slowly or with a hesitation that carried meaning. These acts, though minor, were proof that the internalized fear had limits. The father's quiet murmurs grew bolder, challenging assumptions within himself, questioning morality in ways that had previously been suppressed. The widow's empire, vast in its psychological reach, was not immune to imperfection. Beyond the household, the community sensed the shifts too. Farmers and neighbors reported anomalies: children who faltered at work, the father's distracted presence during chores, and an unsettling stillness that replaced the usual precision. Rumors grew, no longer purely whispers. Speculation spread, and the narrative of absolute mastery began to crack under scrutiny. Observers began to realize that the widow's control, while terrifyingly effective, was not omnipotent. Even the most carefully orchestrated fear could be challenged from within. This stage reveals a dark and necessary truth. Mastery over the mind is not eternal. Resistance begins in the smallest gestures, in subtle hesitation, in the questioning of perceived authority. And when these small acts emerge, no matter how meticulously suppressed, they have the potential to grow, to challenge, and ultimately to dismantle even the most precise and terrifying system of domination. The widow sensed the first tremors of rebellion and responded not with panic, but with a cold, methodical escalation of control. By late summer of 1883, her psychological interventions had reached a terrifying precision that tested the boundaries of fear itself. Small hesitations among the children and father were met with consequences that were invisible yet immediate. Meals were delayed just enough to instill anxiety, tasks were deliberately complicated to measure response, and a single glance could convey disappointment so profound that it left the recipient questioning their very instincts. This was no longer mere household management, it was psychological warfare, conducted with surgical precision. The children, conditioned to obedience, felt the tightening grip of her methods. They performed tasks with heightened awareness, anticipating invisible cues and adjusting behavior to avoid even imagined reprimand. Yet, even as they complied, the subtle cracks persisted. Hesitation flickered in their eyes. Tiny acts of defiance, almost imperceptible, continued to emerge. The father, though outwardly compliant, began testing boundaries with near-silent questions, exploring moral and ethical spaces she had assumed were completely controlled. Each act of internal rebellion became a stimulus, forcing her to adapt her methods further, escalating tension within the household to levels that would unnerve any outsider. The widow's dominance extended beyond mere observation. She orchestrated the very environment to reinforce obedience. The timing of chores, the arrangement of furniture, the placement of objects, all were calibrated to manipulate perception, instill unease, and maintain absolute control. Even the smallest sound, the creak of a floorboard, or the flicker of candlelight became part of a psychological map she had drawn meticulously. Fear was internalized, obedience was instinctive, and the household existed as a controlled ecosystem where every thought and action was monitored, assessed, and subtly corrected. Beyond the walls of the home, the community felt the intensifying grip of her presence. Farmers and neighbors noticed the unnatural precision of the family, the unnerving synchronicity of movements, and the silence that followed minor mistakes. Rumors became more urgent, speculation grew, yet none dared intervene directly. The widow had perfected a system in which fear spread through perception alone, reaching even those at a distance, turning witnesses into silent participants in the maintenance of her dominion. Here is the lesson etched in psychological terror. True mastery is adaptive. It escalates with resistance, recalibrates with observation, and exploits the unseen vulnerabilities of mind and perception. Absolute control is never static. It is a living, breathing system, capable of immense cruelty, without ever striking physically. By late 1883, the subtle disturbances within the household had begun to ripple outward, reaching the broader Nebraska community. Whispers that had once been tentative and scattered hardened into concern. Traders, farmers, and clergy, who had long respected the widow's precision as a mark of domestic discipline, now speculated openly about her methods. Her reputation had grown beyond fear. It had become a question of moral horror. The community, long compliant in avoidance, began to sense the first tangible cracks in the facade of her mastery. External pressures intensified as investigators returned, armed with more than curiosity. They brought purpose, documentation, and a determination to penetrate the widow's invisible dominion. Letters requesting inspections multiplied, and county officials, previously hesitant, realized that rumors were no longer manageable as simple gossip. The widow, sensing the encroachment, adapted her tactics with alarming foresight. Every interaction, every gesture was calibrated to manipulate perception. The children performed flawlessly when observed, the father projected unwavering compliance, and the widow herself exuded a calm that was terrifying in its certainty. Yet beneath the surface, the tension within the household remained palpable. Small acts of hesitation persisted. A child's delayed step, the father's whispered murmur, each signaling that internal resistance, though fragile, could not be entirely suppressed. The widow responded swiftly, not with overt force, but with precision that reinforced her authority psychologically. Subtle cues, imperceptible to outsiders, communicated consequences instantly. A removed glance, a delayed smile, a shifted stance. Every internal defiance was countered with a lesson in obedience, embedding fear deeper into the psyche than physical punishment ever could. Community observers felt these ripples even without entering the house. The air around the property carried a tension that was almost tangible, a subtle unease, a sense of being measured and manipulated. Farmers spoke quietly among themselves, noting small anomalies in behavior, the unnatural quiet of the land surrounding the homestead, and the chilling synchrony of daily routines. Curiosity was laced with dread, fear extended beyond the walls and into the minds of all who considered intervention. Here lies the critical understanding. Influence that operates invisibly, through perception and psychological manipulation, is far more pervasive and enduring than overt force. The widow's power was no longer contained within her household. It had begun to infect the consciousness, of those at a distance. Observation alone could not challenge it. Only the internalization of courage, doubt, or rebellion could. And those who failed to internalize it were already part of her system, unwillingly complicit in the perpetuation of her dominion. By the winter of 1883, the subtle hesitations that had long flickered within the household began to crystallize into deliberate, calculated acts of resistance. The children, though conditioned for years, now tested boundaries with growing confidence, their actions small but deliberate. A chore executed imperfectly, a meal delayed, a glance that lingered too long. These acts, seemingly minor, were the first true seeds of rebellion. The father, emboldened by the subtle shifts in the children, began voicing questions in tones just low enough to avoid immediate detection, probing the limits of the widow's psychological dominion. The widow, ever perceptive, immediately recognized the rising tension. Her response was not overt anger, but a series of precise interventions designed to recalibrate obedience. Meals were strategically withheld, chores subtly reordered, and small disruptions were introduced into the household routine. Every corrective action was invisible to outsiders, almost imperceptible, yet devastating. Effective. Fear, she knew, had to be internalized. External punishment alone could never ensure lasting control. The family began to respond, with heightened awareness, a mix of instinctive compliance and cautious testing of limits. The children's subtle defiance began to influence each other. They observed small lapses and hesitations, noting the widow's reactions, calculating the risk of minor rebellion. The father, too, sensed the first glimmers of agency, internal debates taking shape that questioned both morality and authority. The household, which had once functioned as a seamless extension of the widow's will, now carried the pulse of tension and potential revolt. Beyond the walls, rumors of the household's abnormal precision continued, but now whispers hinted at cracks in the widow's mastery. Observers noticed slight irregularities, small anomalies in behavior that hinted at internal struggle. Traders, clergy, and neighboring farmers speculated, uncertain if the household's obedience was truly absolute or if hidden fissures were widening. Even distant authorities felt a subtle unease, sensing that the widow's empire, formidable though it seemed, was not invincible. Here lies the critical principle. Resistance, even when silent and measured, grows in the smallest hesitations. What begins as imperceptible doubt can evolve into deliberate defiance. And in systems of absolute psychological control, the emergence of internal rebellion marks the beginning of destabilization. The widow had long held dominion over minds, but even the most meticulous architecture of fear cannot eradicate the seed of questioning once it is planted. By early 1884, the widow had recognized the first sparks of rebellion and reacted with calculated intensity. Her methods of control, always subtle and psychological, became sharper, more deliberate, and ruthlessly precise. No longer relying solely on routine or expectation, she began manipulating perception itself. Tasks were timed to the second, objects rearranged to create unease, and even the smallest gesture, a tilt of the head, a pause in speech, carried consequences that the children and father absorbed instinctively. Fear was no longer just taught, it was woven into the very fabric of thought and anticipation. The children, though compliant, now experienced a heightened tension with every action. They began calculating their movements in advance, anticipating invisible cues, trying to gauge which actions would earn approval and which would bring punishment. The father, whose moral hesitation had grown over months, became both a participant and a subtle co-conspirator. He tested boundaries quietly, knowing that his probing, though careful, was already noticed. And the widow, far from flustered, adapted with astonishing precision, countering each internal rebellion before it could fully manifest. Every meal, every chore, every word became a vector of influence. The household was a laboratory of psychological mastery, a place where obedience was enforced not through violence but through anticipation and the internalization of fear. Hunger, slight delays, and the withholding of attention communicated more than words ever could. Compliance was now instinctual. Doubt was dangerous. And yet, the cracks persisted. The very existence of hesitation within a system of absolute control highlighted the limits of even her terrifying methods. Beyond the home, the community felt the intensifying grip of her dominion. Farmers, merchants, and clergy reported not only the precision of household behavior, but the subtle tension that seemed to radiate outward. Those who observed could feel the invisible chains of expectation and fear extending into their own consciousness. Even without entering the home, they were psychologically marked, their perception shaped by the widow's unseen influence. Rumors continued to spread, mixing awe with horror, curiosity with read. Here is the chilling principle. Absolute control is adaptive, relentless, and psychological. It escalates in response to resistance, manipulates perception with precision, and uses anticipation as a weapon more powerful than force. And yet, even in the most perfected system of obedience, subtle rebellion persists. A reminder that fear, no matter how deep, can never fully extinguish human will. By mid-1884, the tension within the widow's household had reached a critical point. The subtle hesitations and minor defiance that had long flickered beneath the surface now coalesced into a deliberate act. The first true breach of absolute control. One of the children, emboldened by months of observation and careful calculation, deliberately delayed a chore, altering the precise sequence that the widow had established. The act was small, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but within the household, it reverberated like a thunderclap. The father, observing silently, allowed the pause to exist, a quiet acknowledgement of resistance he had long yearned to express. The widow noticed immediately. Her eyes, calm yet piercing, swept over the child. There was no anger, no raised voice, only a shift in attention so subtle that the observer would have missed it entirely. But the household felt it instantly, a ripple of tension that carried the message clearly. Defiance had been detected, measured, and noted. Fear intensified, but so too did the internal calculation of the children. They realized that even small acts of resistance could provoke a response, but also that boundaries could be tested. The invisible equilibrium had been disrupted, and the widow's psychological mastery was now engaged in a direct contest with the very minds she had sought to dominate. The father's quiet complicity grew bolder. He began to question aloud, in hushed tones, the morality of the household's routines and the hidden violence of control. Each word was measured, careful, but it represented a fracture in the system the widow had spent years perfecting. The children, sensing his silent encouragement, began small experiments, delayed responses, minor mistakes, intentional hesitations. Each action was a test, a probe into the limits of her omnipotence, and the widow responded as she always had, with surgical precision. Corrections were subtle, terrifying in their invisibility, reinforcing fear without breaking the fragile confidence of the rebels. Outside the home, the community remained largely unaware of the growing defiance, but they felt the tension radiating from the household. Traders and neighbors noted minor anomalies: a child slightly distracted during work, a father moving with faint hesitation. Rumors began to shift from admiration for precision to speculation about cracks in the widow's control. Even distant authorities sensed something amiss, though no one could yet articulate what was happening within the walls of the house. Here lies a critical lesson. Resistance begins in the smallest calculated acts, often invisible to outsiders, but profoundly destabilizing internally. Absolute control is never absolute. Every system of fear carries the seed of defiance within it, and those who plant it, even subtly, begin a process that can eventually unravel the most meticulously constructed dominion. The widow, sensing the first deliberate act of defiance, escalated her methods with chilling precision. By late 1884, her psychological manipulation had become a refined, almost surgical instrument, designed not to punish overtly, but to fracture the mind from within. The child's small act of rebellion did not provoke yelling or violence. Instead, the widow employed subtle measures. The timing of meals shifted, tasks were reordered with imperceptible irregularity, and her gaze lingered in ways that communicated judgment without words. Every subtle correction reinforced the boundaries of obedience, while amplifying anxiety, teaching that deviation, however slight, carried invisible but unavoidable consequences. The children, conditioned for years, felt the tightening of this invisible grip acutely. They calculated every movement, anticipating invisible cues, measuring risk, and balancing instinct with imposed discipline. The father, quietly observing, began to understand the full reach of her control, that her power was not in force, but in perception, anticipation, and the internalization of fear. He too adapted his behavior, masking thoughts and feelings while internally weighing morality against survival. Within the walls of the house, obedience became both instinctive and strategic. Even subtle defiance now carried a cost that reverberated through the psyche of each family member. The widow's influence extended beyond the household. Neighbors, merchants, and clergy began to sense a tension radiating from the property, a subtle aura of control that seemed to touch everything within range. Even brief observation of the family's interactions left outsiders with a lingering sense of unease, a recognition of discipline so precise it bordered on unnatural. The widow had perfected the art of shaping not only the behavior of those under her roof, but also the perceptions and fears of those who looked in from outside. Rumors of cracks in her control circulated cautiously, but no one dared challenge her directly. Inside, the battle between compliance and rebellion continued, invisible to outsiders. Every hesitation, every small misalignment, was a signal to her that internal resistance existed, that the fragile equilibrium of fear and obedience was at risk. And yet, she remained calm, calculating, adapting her strategies to each subtle act of defiance, reinforcing her mastery without ever striking physically. Fear, she knew, needed no hands or weapons. It thrived in anticipation, in the unseen, and in the mind itself. The principle to grasp here is stark. True mastery is psychological, adaptive, and invisible. V's Bible force is secondary. The real power lies in shaping perception, controlling anticipation, and embedding obedience deep within thought. Even when defiance emerges, fear can be recalibrated and control reasserted. But cracks, once formed, leave lasting traces in the mind, and the seeds of eventual disruption take root, unseen but inexorable. By early 1885, the subtle disturbances within the household had begun to attract increasingly deliberate attention from the surrounding community. Whispers, once tentative and scattered, had solidified into urgent concern. Traders, farmers, and visiting clergy spoke in hushed tones about a family whose precision seemed unnatural, whose obedience was nearly mechanical. Rumors suggested not just discipline, but domination. A psychological grip so powerful that those observing felt a palpable tension even at a distance. The widow's reputation had grown beyond fear into the territory of dread, and authorities could no longer ignore the growing unease. County officials dispatched investigators with explicit orders to scrutinize the household, to understand the mechanisms behind the reported anomalies. These men and women approached with a mix of skepticism and apprehension, expecting perhaps a rigid but conventional family. They were unprepared for the invisible architecture of control that awaited them. Within the walls, the children performed with unnerving precision. The father moved with disciplined subservience, and the widow herself radiated calm omnipotence. Every observer sensed the weight of authority in ways that words could not describe, a quiet command that bent perception and anticipation to her will. Despite this external pressure, the cracks within the household persisted. The child who had first defied her continued to experiment with subtle hesitation, calculating the widow's response, testing the boundaries of fear and obedience. The father, emboldened by these small acts, increasingly questioned both morality and survival, exploring spaces of thought that had long been forbidden. Every internal act of defiance was a pulse against her empire, small yet significant. And the widow, far from losing control, escalated her tactics, not with violence but with refined manipulation. Delays, gaze control, micro-adjustments in routines, these became instruments to reinforce obedience and restore equilibrium. Even outside observers, unable to penetrate her home, felt the tension radiating outward. Farmers noted unnatural synchronicity in chores, merchants remarked on the eerie silence that enveloped the property, and clergy sensed the psychological mastery at work, though unable to articulate it fully. Rumors shifted from awe of precision to fear of unseen dominion. Every observation, every report, carried the invisible imprint of the widow's control. The lesson is chilling. Power that operates through fear and perception can extend far beyond direct control. Even scrutiny, meant to dismantle dominance, can be co-opted into its perpetuation. The widow's mastery demonstrates that psychological influence is not confined to walls. It radiates, infects, and reshapes the perceptions of all who encounter it. By mid-1885, the tension within the household had reached its breaking point. The invisible fractures that had long flickered as hesitation and minor defiance now coalesced into a fully conscious, coordinated resistance. The child who had first challenged the widow's authority was no longer acting in isolation. Subtle cues passed between the siblings, small, deliberate acts of rebellion forming a quiet, dangerous network. The father, too, became a key participant, testing limits more boldly, questioning morality aloud in whispers only the children could hear. The household, once a seamless machine of obedience, now pulsed with a hidden life that the widow had not anticipated. The widow recognized the shift immediately. Her strategies, previously sufficient to suppress hesitation, now faced deliberate challenge. She intensified her psychological precision, employing the full arsenal of invisible control, delayed attention, subtle disruptions in routine, the strategic withholding of meals, and the unrelenting intensity of her gaze. Fear, though internalized, was still a weapon. She observed each micro-defiance as one would observe a chessboard, anticipating the next move with the cold calculation of a predator. Yet the household's hidden rebellion was no longer timid. It had gained coherence, and the widow's empire of fear teetered on the brink of confrontation. The children's acts of resistance were ingeniously subtle. Tasks were completed in altered sequences, small hesitations, deliberately timed, whispered exchanges coded to evade the widow's attention. The father encouraged these acts, understanding the power of collective psychological resistance. Together, they tested her dominion, probing vulnerabilities, learning the contours of fear and authority, and discovering that even meticulously imposed control had blind spots. Every subtle defiance became a lesson in autonomy, a small reclaiming of will within the oppressive architecture she had built. Beyond the household, the community now sensed a change, though they could not identify its source. Observers reported moments of irregularity, chores misaligned, the father's distracted presence, children behaving unpredictably under the widow's watchful eye. The aura of omnipotence that had once radiated from the home was fractured, the invisible chains weakened. Even the investigators, long intimidated by the precision of household behavior, noted the first tangible evidence that internal rebellion had begun to erode her power. The principle here is stark. Systems of absolute psychological domination can sustain themselves only until internal resistance gains cohesion. Even fear, meticulously cultivated and internalized, cannot suppress the human will forever. When hesitation becomes strategy and whispers become coordination, even the most terrifying and precise empire begins to crumble. By late 1885, the widow's empire of psychological control began to show undeniable signs of collapse. The subtle network of resistance within the household, once fragile and hidden, had strengthened into deliberate, coordinated defiance. The children, now working in unison, subtly altered routines, communicated through whispered signals, and challenged the timing and structure of daily tasks with increasing confidence. The father, emboldened by their courage, began to act with purpose, asserting small choices that were previously forbidden. The household, which had once functioned as a perfect extension of her will, now pulsed with rebellion that could not be fully contained. The widow, though aware of the growing defiance, found herself unable to suppress it entirely. Her previously infallible techniques of psychological manipulation, invisible cues, withheld attention, ritualized punishment, could still enforce temporary compliance, but cracks had formed in the foundation of fear itself. Each act of rebellion weakened the previously unassailable authority, creating microcosms of autonomy within her domain. She adapted with intense focus, yet the sheer coordination of the family's internal resistance now tested the limits of her power. Outside the home, the community began to notice irregularities that could no longer be explained by simple rumor. Neighbors observed tasks performed in unusual sequences, chores delayed without consequence, and the father's demeanor shifting from rigid compliance to subtle independence. Traders, clergy, and visiting authorities reported an unsettling sense of unpredictability emanating from the property, a disruption in the previously flawless rhythm that had defined the household for years. Even observers at a distance felt the fracture, sensing that the widow's psychological dominion was no longer complete. This collapse demonstrates a profound truth about power. Fear, when internalized, is effective only until collective consciousness asserts itself. The children and father, by reinforcing each other's defiance, created a feedback loop that weakened the widow's authority. Each small act of autonomy served as a lesson in psychological resilience, proving that even meticulously cultivated control can be challenged and dismantled from within. The critical lesson here is unavoidable. No system of domination, however refined, can exist indefinitely without opposition. Internal rebellion, subtle, coordinated, and persistent, has the power to erode fear, reclaim autonomy, and dismantle control. Absolute psychological mastery is fragile in the face of determined resistance, and the human will, once awakened, cannot easily be subdued again. By the winter of 1886, the widow's dominion had finally fractured. The household, once a seamless machine of obedience and fear, had reclaimed a fragile but undeniable autonomy. The children and father now acted with subtle independence, testing boundaries openly yet cautiously, their internal rebellion having matured into deliberate self-determination. The widow, though still present, no longer commanded the absolute authority she had once wielded with terrifying precision. Her psychological empire, meticulously built over years, had been eroded from within. Proof that even the most calculated control cannot suppress the human will forever. Outside the home, the community slowly absorbed the consequences of the household's upheaval. Rumors shifted from awe and dread to a cautious recognition of the household's resilience. Traders and neighbors, once fearful witnesses, now began to acknowledge that internal resistance, when coherent and persistent, could challenge even the most meticulously imposed dominion. Authorities and clergy, previously intimidated by the precision and fear surrounding the widow, noted with quiet astonishment that her power had limits, and that human will, once awakened, could assert itself in subtle yet unstoppable ways. The widow herself remained a figure of haunting presence. She had mastered fear, perception, and psychological manipulation, yet her own creation had become the instrument of her limitation. The household, once a mirror of her control, now reflected autonomy, resistance, and the persistence of conscience. Every whispered act of defiance, every calculated hesitation, had chipped away at her mastery, leaving behind a legacy both terrifying and instructive. Her life, a testament to the extremes of psychological dominance, also revealed its fragility when confronted with coordinated conscious resistance. This final chapter leaves a lesson that resonates far beyond a single Nebraska homestead. Power that operates through fear is never absolute. Even meticulously constructed systems of psychological domination are vulnerable to internal rebellion, to subtle acts of defiance, and to the persistent assertion of human will. Observers and participants alike are marked by the knowledge that control is both influential and fragile, that obedience is a construct maintained only so long as fear remains unchallenged, and that the smallest spark of resistance can ultimately dismantle empires. And here is the haunting reflection to leave you with. The widow's home still stands, cold and silent, yet the invisible imprints of her dominion linger. The echoes of fear, obedience, and rebellion remain etched into the consciousness of all who experienced it. A reminder that power, no matter how absolute, can always be contested, and that the human spirit, once awakened, is never entirely broken. Now, write twice in the comments the phrase, "I claim my will," to seal your own understanding and transformation, and to engage the forces that observe even from the unseen.